You've been taught about survival food, but these 10 forgotten ground beef recipes from your grandparents' era and Native American history will rewrite everything you thought you knew. Imagine foil packets sizzling by a campfire, or a hearty pie born from a victory garden in wartime. These weren't just meals, they were lifelines woven from resourcefulness, tradition, and memory. Before we begin, hit like and subscribe. Today we revisit 10 ground beef recipes that prove survival was never only about food, but about community and creativity. Back in the 1930s, when money was tight and every scrap of food had to stretch, families discovered the simple magic of hobo dinner packets. Picture a ball of ground beef shaped into a patty tucked alongside carrots, onions, and potatoes, then wrapped tight in foil. Tossed over a campfire or into the oven, it was a meal that carried the earthy scent of smoke and the sweetness of roasting vegetables. What made it unforgettable wasn't just the taste, but the moment of unwrapping, the hiss of steam, escaping the savory aroma, rising like a promise that no one would leave hungry. Kids loved peeling back the foil like opening a present, and parents loved how 1 pound of beef could feed the whole crew. But over time, convenience foods and microwaves took over. The ritual of campfire cooking faded, and so did these foil-wrapped suppers. Today they survive mostly on camping trips or scout outings, a nostalgic echo of Depression-era ingenuity. Do you remember trying one of these at a summer camp or maybe in your own backyard? Imagine peeling back that foil again. Would you add a pat of butter and thyme like the old-timers did, or keep it plain and simple? Picture a church basement on a Sunday afternoon in the 1950s. The scent of ground beef, cheese, and tomato sauce wafted upstairs just as the final hymn ended, luring the congregation down to long folding tables. That's where church supper beef squares stole the show. Big casserole pans of seasoned beef topped with cheese cut into perfect squares, each marked with a little toothpick flag so everyone got an even slice. The magic wasn't just in the flavor, but in the ritual. Mrs. Johnson's dish always carried extra oregano, while Mrs. Miller added celery salt so distinct that folks could identify the cook by aroma alone. These suppers weren't just about eating, they were about belonging. No one left hungry, and no one left without a story. As church attendance declined and potluck traditions faded, so did these beef squares. The giant pans gave way to individual frozen meals, and the fellowship of shared casseroles slipped into memory. Do you remember potlucks like this in your hometown? Imagine the sound of chairs scraping on the basement floor and the laughter echoing as people lined up for a slice. Would you choose the corner piece with crispy edges, or the soft center, dripping with sauce? In the 1940s and the 50s, America's factories ran on grit, steel, and simple but hearty lunches. That's where the factory workers' beef roll came in. It wasn't some dainty sandwich, it was a full meal baked into bread. Picture a tender roll of dough wrapped tight around seasoned ground beef, rice, and chopped vegetables, almost like a jelly roll, but made for stamina, not sweetness. Mothers and wives would bake these rolls low and slow, building a sturdy crust that kept the filling moist for hours inside a lunch pail. When the factory whistle blew, workers could slice off a piece knowing the rest would stay fresh for the next break. Some women even tucked in surprises, a ribbon of cheese or a hidden pickle to remind their loved ones of home during those grueling shifts. But as industrial lunchrooms expanded and cafeterias took over, the homemade beef roll faded away. Convenience and uniformity replaced the personal touch baked right into each loaf. Do you think today's grab-and-go sandwiches could ever compare to the pride of unwrapping a homemade beef roll at noon? Imagine biting into that crust after hours of hard work. Would you prefer the classic rice and beef filling, or a version with cheese melting through the center? During the Great Depression, when luxury was out of reach, American home cooks reimagined indulgence with what little they had. That's how the Depression-era meatloaf Wellington was born, a clever twist on the famous British dish. Instead of tenderloin wrapped in puff pastry, families used ground beef seasoned with onions and herbs, then wrapped it in a thin homemade dough made from flour, water, and whatever fat was on hand. As it baked, the crust turned golden and flaky, releasing a savory aroma that made kitchens feel just a little more hopeful. Patterns were often scored into the top: wheat stalks, diamonds, or simple crisscrosses, not just decoration, but a mark of pride, showing care even in tough times. Families gathered around the table, slicing into the loaf as if it were a grand feast, even if it was just a stretched pound of beef. Over time, as prosperity returned, the dish was quietly left behind. Puff pastry became accessible, and meatloaf slipped back into its simpler form. But in its day, this humble Wellington carried dignity, making ordinary Sundays feel like celebrations. If you had to recreate it now, would you keep it plain and true to the Depression kitchen, or dress it up with modern puff pastry to bring back that touch of luxury? In America's growing cities of the early 1900s, boarding houses were more than just places to sleep. They were lifelines for workers, newcomers, and families trying to get by. At the heart of these homes was the boarding house special, a humble yet ingenious ground beef dish. Cooks would mix beef with day-old bread soaked in milk, stretching it further than anyone thought possible. The clever twist, a splash of leftover morning coffee stirred into the mix, giving the meat a deep, smoky flavor that felt far richer than its ingredients. Meals were served family style at long tables where strangers became companions over plates of this hearty dish. Spices varied from house to house, passed down like heirlooms, making each boarding house's special slightly different. Some added potatoes as filler, others whipped up a gravy from coffee and scraps of vegetables to pour over the top. As urban life changed and boarding houses gave way to apartments and diners, this dish vanished. Yet for those who lived it, the memory of sharing food stories and laughter in those crowded dining rooms lingered long after the recipe was forgotten. If you'd been there, would you have savored the richness of the gravy or just piled on extra potatoes to make sure you stayed full? Out on the wide prairie, where one-room schoolhouses stood against endless skies, young teachers carried more responsibility than just lessons. Many lived far from home, often boarding with local families, and they cared for their students in ways that stretched beyond books. One of their quiet traditions was the prairie school teacher's casserole. Each family contributed what they could spare, some potatoes, a little ground beef, maybe a jar of beans or corn. The teacher would gather these offerings and layer them into a single dish, baked in the warmth of the school's wood-burning stove. A simple topping of cornmeal and crushed crackers turned golden and crisp sealing in the flavors beneath. On cold winter days, the aroma filled the classroom, and when the noon bell rang, the children were fed not just a meal, but a sense of being cared for. Over time, as schools grew larger and cafeterias replaced those humble kitchens, the casserole faded into memory. What survived was the spirit of generosity, a reminder that even the smallest communities could find comfort in shared meals. Do you remember a teacher or neighbor who looked after kids in ways that went beyond teaching? If you could taste this casserole today, would you prefer it filled with summer vegetables or hearty root crops for winter warmth? In bustling American cities of the mid-20th century, corner stores weren't just places to pick up bread and milk. They were little gateways to the wider world. Immigrant shopkeepers, often from India or Pakistan, introduced locals to something new, curry beef, made with familiar ground meat and bold, unfamiliar spices. Imagine walking past a narrow grocery and catching the fragrance of coriander, cumin, and turmeric drifting into the street. Inside a pot simmered with onions, garlic, and spice blends so carefully measured they were portioned into little paper bags. Customers weren't just sold ingredients, they were handed handwritten recipes, a taste of another culture folded into their own kitchens. Families would carry those spice-scribbled bags home, learning to blend tradition with convenience, and soon curry beef became a neighborhood favorite. But as large supermarkets spread and standardized what Americans ate, those corner stores disappeared. With them went the warmth of being taught face-to-face how to transform simple ground beef into a dish that carried history in every bite. Do you remember your first taste of curry? Was it mild and fragrant or fiery enough to make your eyes water? And if your local corner store still offered those handwritten spice blends, would you give them a try today? Out on the farm, harvest season was more than hard work, it was a celebration. After long days in the fields, farm wives knew how to turn ground beef and garden vegetables into a dish that could feed a crowd, the harvest time hot dish. Layers of potatoes formed the base, soaking up all the juices. On top went seasoned beef, sweet corn, beans, and tomatoes picked that very morning. And tucked secretly in the middle, a layer of cream-style corn that baked into a sauce, tying everything together. Every region had its touch. In Minnesota, wild rice sometimes joined the mix. In Iowa, it was all about that golden corn. When the pan came out of the oven, bubbling and rich, it wasn't just nourishment, it was gratitude served family style. Neighbors would gather passing plates after a long day's work, sharing laughter and stories with every spoonful. But as farming changed and convenience crept in, these hot dishes slipped from daily life. Canned soups and boxed dinners replaced the careful layering of fresh produce. Do you recall a meal that marked the change of seasons in your own family? If you had to recreate this one, would you keep the hidden cream corn layer or swap it out for your own secret ingredient? Long before casseroles became a mid-century trend, Swedish immigrants in the Midwest brought something special to the American table, the potato beef casserole. It wasn't flashy, but it had an elegance all its own. Thin slices of potato were layered like shingles on a roof, each brushed with a silky cream sauce scented with nutmeg and white pepper. Beneath those careful rows sat seasoned ground beef, its juices seeping down to flavor every slice. When it came out of the oven, the dish was golden and bubbling with a scent that made entire holiday gatherings pause in anticipation. This wasn't just dinner, it was heritage baked into a pan, a piece of the old world settling into the new. Each family guarded their variation closely, some adding a hint of onion, others sprinkling breadcrumbs on top for a crispy finish. Over time, instant mixes and frozen dinners dulled the art of layering by hand. The patience this dish demanded didn't survive the rush of modern kitchens. But for those who remember, it was more than food. It was a symbol of care, craft, and tradition. Do you remember a dish in your family that required this kind of careful layering? And if you had the chance, would you take the time to bring it back? If you're enjoying this trip, hit like and subscribe for more forgotten flavors and the stories behind. During World War II, when ration books dictated what made it to the dinner table, Victory Gardens became a lifeline. Families planted beans, carrots, potatoes, and whatever else would grow in their backyards. Out of this effort came the Victory Garden beef pie, a dish that was more than food. It was a quiet act of patriotism. Ground beef, precious and rationed, was stretched with garden vegetables, layered into a crust, often mixed with mashed turnips or parsnips to save flour for the troops. The pie was hearty, colorful, and nourishing. The steam rising from its golden crust carried the scent of roasted vegetables and beef, reminding families that even in lean times, creativity could keep spirits high. Each slice told a story of neighbors trading harvests, mothers stretching every ounce, and communities pulling together. As convenience foods and supermarkets expanded after the war, these pies quietly disappeared. They became symbols of hardship rather than recipes to be passed down. But think about it, if you had to recreate one today, would you plant your own garden and swap with your neighbors like they once did? Or would you hunt for shortcuts at the store? Either way, this dish still whispers the resilience of the 1940s kitchen. These weren't just ground beef recipes, they were snapshots of survival, creativity, and the warmth of family tables. From hobo packets steaming over campfires to the pride of a Depression-era Wellington, each dish carried more than flavor, it carried resilience. Some faded as times changed, while others still whisper through family traditions today. Which of these forgotten meals would you bring back to your own kitchen? And do you think they taste just as good now as they did then? Share your thoughts in the comments, your memories. Keep these stories alive. If you enjoyed this trip through the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us again for more journeys into America's vintage food history. After all, some recipes are more than meals. They're memories worth keeping.